tonight. I'm Joe Meinert. I'm the City of Bowie Planning Director, and tonight is the first in a series of Community Climate Action Series presentations. It's part one, Getting Smart on Climate Change. We have another meeting scheduled in November that's devoted to saving energy at your home and office. It will be in this room on November 20th, and we would invite you to come for that as well. And we're also scheduling one in January that will focus on bikes, trails, and public transit. So we will provide the time and date once we set that meeting. So this is a series of meetings. We're trying to get the word out about climate action and what the community can do. We're working a subgroup of the Green Team. Mr. Tom Sykes is here this evening. He's a member of that energy subgroup. Also with us tonight, our guest speaker is Ms. Joan Rohlfs from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. You're the Environmental Programs Director. Is that your position?
Environmental Resources Program.
Resources. Okay, yes. Thank you very much for coming. And also with us is Kristen Larson, who is the city's sustainability planner. Then I will make a presentation about the city's greenhouse gas analysis that we've done for the community. And then we also have a list of community measures which have been developed, things that we can do as a community to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gas in our community. And we'd like to try to get feedback on those measures. We have those measures posted on the city website, so anybody can go there and make comments about it. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this series, is to try to get input on the likely community measures that we can adopt for Bowie. I also wanted to put in a plug on our website. We have a carbon footprint calculator, and if you haven't gone there and used that yet, it's a tool that we've taken from an outside source that you can put in your electric information, usage information, your water usage information, things like that, and it will calculate your own greenhouse gas emissions for your property. So we have those things out there as resources, and what I'd like to do is at this point turn it over to Joan Rohlfs, and we'll make the presentation and then we'll take questions immediately following. Let me bring this up. Okay, it's ready.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Well, thank you for inviting me to Bowie, and I'm glad to see that you all are interested in climate change. I know that my staff and I have been working on this. We did a climate change report. It's called the National Capital Climate Change Report that we published in 2008. Since then, we've been keeping up with the research. We've been working with NASA, with NOAA, with some federal agencies, with the Maryland National Capital Planning Commission, with the National Capital Planning Commission, and trying to find out exactly what can we expect from climate change in this region. How can we prepare for it? I have to tell you that the Amanda Campbell is my scientist on this team. She was unable to make it today. She would probably give you a lot better handle on numbers and so on, but I will give you basically the overview of what we have in our National Capital Region Climate Change Report. So just a little background on the Council of Governments. We have 22 local governments. It's a regional planning agency, so to speak. We have jurisdictions, counties, and municipalities in Maryland. It includes the District of Columbia, and then counties and municipalities in Northern Virginia. We have policy committees. Our main policy board is the COG Board of Directors. We also do have the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board, which plans all of the transportation projects in this region. Have to go through this committee and be part of this national transportation plan that is approved every year. I also manage the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee that plans to bring this region into attainment to meet the federal air quality standards, and right now we're working on meeting the ozone standard. And I also manage the Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee, which was created to implement the climate recommendations made in our climate report. So, and I already mentioned that we did a National Capital Region Climate Change Report. That's the picture of it there. And the COG Board, after created this committee, the Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee, to implement the recommendations in the report. And then the COG Board also adopted a vision called Region Forward 3 years ago, which has a sustainability vision plan. Now, our work at the Council of Governments on Climate Change really started 3 years ago when we received a Smart Growth Implementation Assistance Grant from EPA to give us some technical assistance to work on climate change and adaptation efforts. And that really got us into this work, and we focused on 4 sectors. How will climate change affect transportation planning, land use, buildings, and water? And so we worked with professionals in those areas. First, we developed fact sheets. This is what the experts say is going to happen, what the scientists say, and what do you need to know in order to plan for these future events. So this section, I'm going to talk about what we learned from NASA, what we've learned from the National Climate Assessment, and from the regional scientists at the University of Maryland. And we held a climate impact symposium in May of last year to talk about impacts that can be expected. All right, so the best way that we know of is, well, let's talk about the projected climate change in the Chesapeake Bay region. It's virtually certain that there will be higher levels of CO2, carbon dioxide, and higher sea levels. It's very likely that the temperatures will be warmer, that there will be higher winter and spring precipitation. And it's likely that there will be more intense precipitation, flashier stream flow, increased winter stream flow, and increased storm intensity. Oops. Okay. So this is an example of how the summer temperature changes will change the estuary. So the A2, the red example, is where the estuary is expected to be in 2050 with the higher CO2 emissions scenario. And this is an estimate from Dr. Bosch, who's at the University of Maryland and studies climate change there. So it's expected that with the highest emissions scenarios, we will see an estuary that moves up further north from the southern tip to more up towards New England, and this is one scenario. How much will the sea level rise? Well, the world is experiencing unequivocal warming trend, and we're expecting that sea level rise. There is a range of how we're predicting this. Global models of sea level rise are complex, but clear trends are established. Locally, we experience geological subsidence as well. A little more than a third is subsidence. We've seen a lot of sea level rise in the Chesapeake Bay. It's experienced over 1 foot of sea level rise over the past century. And part of this is due to subsidence, the fact that the ground is sinking in addition to the water level, sea level rise. NASA says that the Chesapeake Bay could experience 9 inches of sea level rise by 2020, and another 1.5 to nearly 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100, which includes, again, subsidence. So the higher range is due, and you see the higher range here, that the highest part of that bar would only happen with accelerated ice cap melting scenario. So some adaptation plans are using the 4 feet by 2100 as this 2100 4 feet up here would be up here in that range as a higher end plausible scenario. So there is going to be flooding in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and much of this is due to storm surge as well as sea level rise. So storm surge floods will become a significant threat in the long term with added sea level rise. And the worst storm surge on record is Hurricane Isabel in 2003, which was nearly 10 feet. In the past 40 years, there's been an increase in Atlantic hurricane strength and activity. In 2090, there's expected to be, sorry. I don't seem to be able to. No, sorry about that. There we go. Okay, here we go. So this shows the Potomac River Basin flooding is one source. Storm surge is another source here that's affecting this metropolitan area, and urban drainage is another big problem. So these are the different types of flooding that you have in the Washington, D.C. area. So this is the this is a Chesapeake inundation prediction system, and it shows how the flood types are expected and what areas are expected to be affected here. So you see, here's the National Mall, but you have this red area is expected to, this is sea level rise increases plus Hurricane Isabel flooding risk. The red is a 1.5 meter increase. The purple is 2.2 meters. And this visualization is intended only as a demonstration of what areas would be affected by these kinds of increases in due to flooding from storm surge and something like Hurricane Isabel. So you see that Arlington, much of Alexandria would be underwater. The tidal basin around that area would be underwater. By the way, this is where National Airport is, in case any of you use that area. Very prone to flooding and very vulnerable. Oops, okay. So these risks indicate a pressing need for substantial action to limit the magnitude of climate change and to prepare for adapting to its impacts. Now, here are the impacts, and we look at the various drivers. So, energy. There will be seasonal changes in demand, increased short-term disruptions. Seasonal changes in demand meaning that we expect warmer, hotter summers, and that will affect the demand for energy. And you see that this is due to the climate drivers here are heat, precipitation, variability, severe storms, and sea level rise. So, emergency management systems. The increased demand for emergency management systems response to extreme weather comes from all four of these drivers: heat, precipitation, variability, severe storms, and sea level rise. Increased damage to property from severe weather events comes from, again, all four: heat, increased precipitation, severe storms, and sea level rise. Expansion of flood-prone areas, increase in flood frequency, inland drainage, riverine and coastal drainage, and increased health impacts due to heat, vector-borne diseases, severe events, and flooding. And this is something that we are paying increasing attention to, the health impacts, because we see that with the increase in average temperature every year, that we're going to have, this will have an impact on the elderly, on people who have chronic respiratory problems, because it will increase ozone levels, it will increase air pollution, and it will also increase vector-borne diseases such as mosquito and tick-related diseases. So, as I said before, we met with different sectors to talk about what these kinds of, what flooding, what flooding, increased sea level rise, increased temperatures, and increased heat, what does this mean for the transportation sector, for example? And so we met with them to identify what critical transportation assets there are. You need to identify what are the bridges, what are the, perhaps the airport runways, various, roads that may be vulnerable to this kind of flooding or increased heat. And these need to be managed and maintained. We need to update the standards for the infrastructure, and it's going to lead to higher maintenance costs. We need to protect and strengthen, to build seawalls and buffers and design changes when rebuilding. And all of this, I attended a very interesting meeting about the efforts that are being taken along by the California Coastal Commission to protect the seawalls and to protect the beaches and the coast along the California coast. And they find that because of, there are a lot of very wealthy people that own property along, on the California coast, and they are the ones who are heavily investing in seawalls and buffers, where you find that the public beaches that are maintained by the government, they can't afford to build these huge seawalls and buffers. So the California Coastal Commission is struggling with this inequality in resources and dealing with how do we protect the coastline. It seems like the wealthy private property is being protected better than the public property, and so this is something that needs to be taken into account. And we need to enhance redundancy. There has to be some backup plan, and also one way to deal with rising sea level rise with storm surges is to take facilities and relocate them. To avoid. For example, and you see some of this down at Hampton Roads in Virginia when they were flooded, many of them are starting to think now about building their houses up or abandoning them altogether and just, taking them and moving them inland. But, you have to do something. It's very difficult to stay where you are. And one of the big things, and I think we may get into this a little bit later, is the disincentives involved here. So land use approaches. So the disincentives for future development in vulnerable areas. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources is doing a great job with looking at the coastal the sea line, the coastline along the state of Maryland, and trying to deal with discouraging future development. But actually a more important piece of legislation that has really had more effect than anything is the federal insurance for flood areas and for emergency areas, and the fact that last year Congress passed legislation which expanded the map of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management System, and properties located in the FEMA area are going to have to pay much higher rates for federal flood insurance, and that has been a real deterrent to further development and to maintaining property. When you have when your flood insurance, your annual rate increases by 100% or something, that's a real deterrent. Another approach that we are promoting is to promote compact mixed-use infill development. So develop around non-vulnerable areas and don't, develop away from these the areas that are vulnerable to flooding, and protect areas with high ecosystem service value, and establish funds to acquire land in vulnerable areas. And that's one of the things that the Maryland Department of Natural Resources is doing. And another thing that we are doing and we are trying to get a handle on is very important to enhance tree canopy for a number of reasons. But one of them is that trees are a sink; they absorb CO2, and so they help with reducing CO2 emissions from that standpoint. But they also, their root systems, they help absorb water in the ground. They retain water. It's that's a natural way of trying to prevent the damage from flooding and storm surge. Building sector approaches. All right, so we've been trying to promote green building programs. Green building programs, and such as the LEEDs building, are buildings that incorporate things like passive solar, operate windows or ventilation in the event of power failures. They may have large rainwater cisterns. They are oriented to make the most of the sun. And they have different features that can reduce the impact of a building and reduce its energy use, which is very important. And this also is connected to low impact development, which is looking at the surrounding property and trying to make sure that it is consistent with stormwater runoff. It's trying to absorb the rainwater. It's trying to make the most of the environment, and you reduce the need for pavement. You use gravel instead of asphalt. So these are ways of doing that. Heat reduction strategies are to develop green roofs, cool pavements. Cool pavements are these white colored pavement that reflect heat. And retrofitting buildings to improve their energy efficiency and to make them more flood-proof, and to incorporate passive survivability into new and existing projects. And the water sector approaches, and we talk to water planners as well, that we're talking about increased stormwater management, maintaining the system. This is a picture of the Washington Harbor after flooding in the 2012 flood, and it's something like 10 feet of water in front of this Potomac basin. And it was basically due to a human failure to raise the flood wall. There's a flood wall here, and they just didn't raise it in time, and they suffered a lot of property damage as a result. So another way for the water sector to improve this is to maintain wetlands and forests and vegetation buffers, and to prioritize power restoration, so that it's important to have the water systems back up and running, and also the blue plains and the systems like that should be operating as well as soon as possible after flooding. And also to increase drought preparedness, because there's going to be a variability in these intense events in the future. So there will be flooding, but there also could be periods of drought as well. So flood protection is again another strategy. So what are the challenges? Well, there's going to be a variation among the jurisdictions. You saw the map where much of Alexandria National Airport and Arlington, that shoreline and their jurisdiction will be underwater in case of storm surge or high rain events. And yet other areas like, let's say, Prince William County, which is in Virginia, which is also part, and Loudoun County, will not have, sure, they don't have coastlines so much. So they may experience some periods of drought while others are going to be underwater. So it could be very variable within this region. And another challenge is how do we get people to start planning for this when it's, this is a long-term event. We're talking about 2020, 2050, and we've got immediate needs, and that's really the biggest challenge. I think getting people to think ahead and think about the next generations, the next decades. Can we plan for them now? Do we have the resources to plan for them now? Do we have the resources to prepare for it now? So these are big questions, and there have been some parts of the country that have actually sort of taken this on. In King County, the state of Washington has started looking at and planning for future climate change challenges. The city of New York is developing an adaptation plan. And, well, you might say, yeah, because they suffered immediate, something very much like what they might have more frequently in the future with this recent flooding. So, yes, there are some areas that are extremely vulnerable to climate change and to this kind of sea level rise and storm surges, and they're the ones that we're going to see probably taking the lead on this. What are the needs? Well, the needs are that we need to do cost-benefit analysis. We need to identify low-cost, no-regrets measures. That is, measures that are going to benefit everyone regardless of whether or not you believe in climate change. If you do this, you know that it will prevent future flooding. It will prevent future storm surge damage from future storm surges. And we need to quantify the cost of inaction, and that's very hard to do. How do we convince people that if they do nothing, it's not good, it's going to actually be costly in the long run? And we need to identify inland strategies and justify funding, and really it keeps coming back to funding and resources. So basically, just to review, it's virtually certain that there will be higher levels of carbon dioxide, high levels. It's very likely that the temperatures will be warmer. We will have higher winter and spring precipitation, and it's likely that there will be more intense precipitation, flashier stream flow, increased winter stream flow, and increased storm intensity. So our planning principles are to scope out the sectors, talk about the impacts or the geographic areas, and then consider, how does this affect current issues, and how does it work within what we're trying to plan for now. We need to identify our methods, look at scenarios, talk to people, gather feedback, and try to think regionally. And again, we're looking for win-win or no-regret solutions, things that if you do them, it will save people money, like energy efficiency, retrofitting your home, putting in more efficient HVAC systems. There are things that you can do to make your home more energy efficient, to make office buildings, government buildings more energy efficient, and that is going to save money. So that's definitely a win-win, and it's a no-regret solution at the same time. So the next steps for us at the regional level is that we are meeting with the water utilities to talk about, is there a need with the future potential for droughts? Is there a need for more water storage, for another reservoir in the Washington region? Arlington Community has adopted an Arlington Community Energy Plan where they're looking at creating microgrids. Have you heard about microgrids and distributed generation? That's another way of looking at how to, it's kind of an energy, it's also being seen as an energy security measure. Instead of relying on Pepco or Dominion or Baltimore Electric and Gas, these are often found in college campuses or military bases, there's a power generation source on site that generates all the power needed by the facility, and it's distributed to the various buildings in the facility. And if PEPCO goes out, if there's a big storm that wipes out all of the power in the region, the likelihood of this isolated microgrid going out is very low. They usually survive, and so that's why you see them on military bases, on college campuses, and more businesses are looking at this as a way of making sure that there is energy security and reliability, reliable energy. I think everyone was sort of turned off by the power outages that we had a couple of years ago, and they're looking at ways to get around the big utilities. And at first the utilities fought this. They said, no, this is taking away our business. We want to be selling everyone electricity or gas. We want to be selling power to everyone. But because of all the demands, the growing demands for electricity and for gas, the utilities are starting to be more receptive to this kind of microgrid development, and they're actually seeing it as a way of trying to avoid building new power plants, for example, that they don't have to invest in a new plant if they have a new development here going online that may be putting in its own power source. So that's just something that we're, at the regional level, that we're looking at as a way of guaranteeing more reliable power that will be there in case of potential blackouts or emergency events. And we have been talking to universities, we've been talking to the military about this, and we've been talking to the military about sharing some of its power from its grid with the community around it. So that's something that the military is starting to look into, so that's another way of doing it. And there are a number of different plans in the region that different jurisdictions like Arlington and the District of Columbia have developed to try to determine what they would do, how they can adapt and take steps to adapt to the kinds of climate impacts that I've discussed. So I'll stop there, and
that's very interesting content, Joan. Thank you very much. Okay, I wanted to cover some material very quickly in terms of what the city has been doing in the way of climate analysis at the community level. We're a member of the organization known as ICLEI, which does a lot of climate work at the local government level. They've provided us with some standard software for calculating greenhouse gas emissions. There was, a couple of years ago, a study done funded through the Department of Energy of the city's local government operations, and so we have the local government greenhouse gas analysis in place. We went on to develop our own, as the bottom bullet identifies, that we began work on this, and we are now ready to share some of the results with the community. And what this is leading up to is a climate action plan for the city at the city level. I'm going to skip through this presentation. This was prepared for another group, but what we've done in terms of considering the factors in our community greenhouse gas analysis, well, we look at population, number of households within the commercial sector. We look at areas of commercial floor space, number of employees, commercial establishments, and then industrial sector, looking at the square footage of buildings, as well as the number of employees and establishments in those sectors. We were able to come up with a baseline calculation of what we had in place. Our base year was 2007, which was the same year that the local government analysis was done, and our forecast year was 2017, and this is representing essentially a build out of our area, and those would be the quantities and the growth that we would anticipate. The computer software run generated a baseline equivalent of CO2 emissions in metric tons of over 300,000 or 307,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions. With the growth only, which is a scenario that I showed you the data on in the previous slide, that would indicate that our growth would generate about 346,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions. Under the projection, which is where we're hoping to go based on other external factors such as improvement in fuel economy for vehicles, improvements in energy efficiency and construction, we think that the 2017 projection can be a little bit lower than the straight line growth projection. That's about 330,000 metric tons. And so even under that scenario of the projection, you're still going from 307,000 metric tons to growth of 330 metric tons projected. So what we're really trying to do is find ways that the community can reduce the effects or the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions by reducing certain activities. One of the things that was observed was that the community must be involved in the greenhouse emission reductions, because greenhouse gas emissions devoted to city government operations represents only 2.9% of the community emissions in 2007. So we know for a fact that it's only a small amount that's generated by local government operations. So it's really the community that must step forward to try to help to address those greenhouse gas reductions. These two graphs are a little complicated to review, but we did some work using some federal energy reports for both the residential sector as well as the commercial energy sector. These graphs are just various scenarios that were studied by the federal government, and what we did was we picked what's called the reference scenario, the purple line, and we picked the year, our anticipated year of 2017, to develop the estimate for the likely greenhouse gas emissions from residential energy and from commercial buildings. And likewise, use the federal energy reports to be looking at improvements in fuel economy and looking at the graphed future estimates, picking our forecast year of 2017 and using that data to crank into the greenhouse gas model. So just to go back to the pie charts again so that you can understand the overview, there are basically four sectors: residential, commercial. Those are buildings that generate the need for electricity through their heating and cooling systems and use of electricity. Vehicles, all the transportation sector, including all types of vehicles. And then the waste sector. The waste sector is the purple piece of the pie, which is the smallest, represents the smallest proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions expected now as well as expected in the future. So you can see from the pie itself that really the opportunity exists to go after reductions in both the residential and commercial building category, and then also to focus on the reduction in vehicle emissions for the future. What we came up with was a list of likely measures, and I mentioned this at the outset, that we've been working on trying to find things that would work in Bowie to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And what I'd like to do is share with you the document that we've created, which is on our website. It's open for public comment now, and we would like to focus on it a little bit this evening. There's basically, it matches up with those categories that I mentioned: the waste sector, the transportation sector, and the energy sector. What we'd like to do this evening is just run through these very quickly, the topics that are covered by our list, and then to break out into an exercise and have you all spend a little bit of time providing us with some input through a little system that we've devised. to try to rank what you feel are the most likely measures or the more important measures on our list. So within the energy sector, there are basically 4 elements to that. Residential buildings is the first one. Doing whatever we can do in the residential energy sector, and this would include looking at energy efficiency, energy audits of commercial or residential buildings. The second category is commercial, and trying to reach out to commercial businesses through things like green business recognition programs, rewarding people who are doing energy efficient things in their business. Also promoting the state of Maryland's Green Registry, which is an information sharing website that businesses can go on and identify practices that they're actually doing, and then other businesses can look and learn from those examples. The next 2 are related to green building, and we heard Joan talk about green building in her presentation, to try to feature or showcase the green building examples throughout the city so that people can learn from those. And then the 4th energy item is to encourage and incentivize the installation of renewable projects within the city. We could use the city's cable TV channel, for example, to educate the public on the options for purchasing renewable energy from utilities or alternative power providers. The second grouping, and there's 3 of these, is in the transportation category. The first is to promote and incentivize the reduction of single occupant vehicles throughout the city. And the city is currently engaged in things like Bike to Work Day, Car Free Day. The council's passed resolutions for the past few years identifying a certain day of the year as Car Free Day in Bowie, and that is the program that's encouraged by the Council of Governments. The next category for transportation is to investigate opportunities to reduce vehicle miles of travel citywide. And with that, I think one of the things that we're trying to do is work more closely with WMATA in terms of how the bus routes are provided in Bowie. Also promoting the assets that we have, such as the MARC station, the Northview Park and Ride lot, to reduce the amount of vehicle miles of travel. And then the last transportation category is to support and facilitate the development of low-carbon transportation choices and improve the efficiency of existing transportation options. And here we're going to probably focus mostly on biking and walking as the options to try to accomplish that. The final set of variables that we're studying includes the waste categories. The first item being to increase recycling rates, reduce the generation of waste, such as through composting programs or things like that, promote the reuse of materials, and then lastly, improving the footprint of the waste collection system. And one of the things that we're talking about, we're just going to put on the table, is to consider switching to a once-a-week trash and recycling pickup program. So within each of these categories that I've highlighted, we have a number of specific measures that have come up as a result of our own internal staff discussions, and our Green Team's Energy Committee subcommittee looked at them and provided input as well. What we really want to do with this list is take it out to the community through our series of these next 3 meetings and get public comment on it. Like I said, it's on the website. We'd like you to think about it. If you have any other measures that you don't see here that you think the city ought to consider. Again, we're talking about things handled at the city level, not something that might work in Washington State or California, but something that would work in Bowie, because we're trying to do the best job we can to create a plan, a climate action plan, which will have measures identified that we could take that will have real impacts on greenhouse gas emission reductions. So I appreciate your time tonight, coming out on a rainy night, and like I said earlier, we have another session coming up in November 20th. We're going to have some speakers here from BGE and Maryland Energy Administration, and as well as a contractor that does energy audits and energy efficiency improvements. So there's a lot that you can learn by coming out to the next session. We will also be talking about this, again, trying to get more input from people who attend that session, So just keep this stuff in the back of your mind, and if you have any questions, please let Kristen or I know. And if you have further comments or if you want to get more involved, stay in touch with us. So appreciate your time tonight, and hopefully we'll have something to report and wrap up and reflect the contributions that have been made here. So we'll be sure to let everybody know how things are going. All right, so thank you.
Thank you.